Today's video was supposed to be about the photography of David Lynch, but Tatiana had a terrible time trying to find examples of his photography, and so before it all went bonkers, we've decided to include, besides photography, photogravures, lithographs and other mixed media, and title this video "The Visual Art of David Lynch." Smart in it. So yeah, without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic to Tat and let her talk. By the way, if you're wondering, I'm Diane.
So, as my assistant just told you, we're going to be diving into the photography of David Lynch and also included some visual, artworks that he made with other mediums. And so I came across all this information as I was preparing my video on Twin Peaks, in this case, the photography lessons we can take from Twin Peaks. So if you haven't watched that one, go watch it afterwards. I think it's an interesting video. And yes, I came across really interesting articles that talked about the series of photos that David Lynch made between the 1980s and the early 2000s about, or revolving around, factories and abandoned factories in this case. And it's interesting that this is a mix of film and digital, and it's interesting to look at this as a sort of homage to the industrial age. And he traveled, from what I understood, through the United States, in this case New York and New Jersey, but he also came to Europe, and in this case I think he visited the East Germany, Poland and the north of England. So for those of you who don't know, I'm based in the north of England, and there's a lot of cities around here, and they used to be quite industrial cities such as Leeds, Bradford, Kingston upon Hull, Liverpool, Manchester, etc. I read that Lynch points out that these places are all uninhabited, there's no people anywhere, and that is what you feel. Time is passing, you feel the presence of death, you are witnessing a dead body and watching nature bringing it back to the elements. And one interesting thing about this is that looking at his photographs and his photogravures, I can identify a specific imagery or visual motives that he transports across the many mediums he touches. To me, there's this idea of death and darkness surrounding the industrial relationship of man and machine. This inherent idea of mutual destruction, of even self-destruction, of paranoia, of surrealism and absurdism. The idea of metamorphoses and machines and the enigmatic qualities and questions surrounding them, which goes from photos to photogravures, films, paintings, etc. And so one really important lesson in here is also when a lot of people question me all the time as well if I have any tips about style, about, just cohesion, and talking about like how can I make my body of work more cohesive or more, identifiable, or my style more identifiable. And I think looking at David Lynch is a really good example, because if you put side by side paintings, drawings, lithographs, films, you can see that there's this sense of connection between them. And this goes to show that if you're an artist, a visual creator, photographer, somebody who just does it for fun, and you want to dabble into other, let's say, mediums or art forms, just do it. Just try it and see where it leads you. But the most important thing is to take in consideration your identity or your personality or what you want to say with your art. So when I say my identity or your identity, I mean like those thoughts, those ideas, those messages that really touch us and that we know that we want to bring with our work, and we know that we want to feature with our work. So I guess that the most important thing here is to not worry about, let's say, more like the physical ideas or the physical proportions of the work, but more like what goes behind that and what connects it all, which is the moods that they produce, the ideas, the people, the themes, the sensations, and etc. Because I feel that if you actually do this, and I try to do this with other things that I kind of like dabble into, as I take a step back, I can realize that these are connected because some of the ideas, some of the messages that I want to pass through the things that I create are there, and I can feel it, whether that is through words, through paintings, through photos, and other things that I do. It's interesting that in recent videos I've talked a lot about texture, and I think to talk about David Lynch and not talk about texture is kind of a miss. And I think his emphasis over texture has to do with the fact that he's a visual artist. He deals with mixed media on paper, with oil paintings, with different drawing tools. And thinking of this out loud, it does make sense that he has this extreme acute sense of texture and the importance of texture in art. And so it seems to me that he really likes to bring smoke, shadows, electricity into his art, perhaps to emphasize the bizarre, the concept of wasteland, or maybe the idea of death and destruction, which he explores in many of his films, where we're often confronted with stories where realities are distorted, become surreal, dreamy, or somehow become chaotic, despite the initial perfect or normal appearance. And it's interesting to refer that David Lynch refuses to interpret his own work. And I really identify with this because sometimes there's no exact reasoning or justification for why certain ideas are with us or why we want to talk about this or that. And so what David Lynch says is that every viewer gets a little bit of a different thing looking at anything. And so it's a circle between the viewer and the piece, and it's different with each viewer. And so it's interesting to think of this as a sort of tip, as in sometimes we find ourselves creatively going through creative blocks, going through bad times, not inspired, or perhaps trapped in our own thinking, in our own methods. And so what I feel that is interesting to observe with David Lynch is that sometimes we just need to leave our instincts guide us. And if we have to leave questions open, then we should leave it. And I think it's what is interesting about his work, and what I said before that I like so much about his work, is that the idea that he opens a sort of space for you to come in and take your own conclusions without actually telling you what it means. And I think it's kind of like a mutual participation within the object or within the film, within the painting, and etc. And so I think this is interesting in both ways, which is just allow some sort of subjectivity to come in, and also just, sometimes it's best to leave it for our instinct to guide us. And so if you think that David Lynch's photography, or in this case visual art, revolves just around this idea of man and machine, there's also a really interesting series that he has, specifically photogravures on trees. And I like the idea of that he explores of the light and shadow in these, and it kind of like reminds me of surrealism, and it kind of like reminds me of his own surrealism, of his absurdism. And so if you look back in time, we can also find a lot of traces of trees being used as surrealist elements and in surrealist paintings. And also there's another series of nudes, which for obvious reasons I can't show you here, but the two photos that I found that were quite acceptable to show you here, they kind of reflect on the exploration of the body, its shapes, contours, and textures. And if you're into factories, mills, machines, and wherever else, check out the work of Bern and Ila Becha, who are two incredible artists who explore these as subjects in their photography, or maybe if you want a video about them, drop me a hint down below.
So yeah, it was a pleasure making this video. I hope it has been helpful in any way, and I guess we'll see you here for a next video very soon. Until then, stay safe and keep shooting film. Peace. Are we done now?
Yeah.
Thank God.